Harold Jennings thought his beloved wife had returned from the grave to comfort him in his darkest hour. For weeks, Margaret's voice echoed through their empty home. Her familiar silhouette appeared in doorways, and her gentle touch soothed his aching heart. Harold was overjoyed, until the night she demanded he join her in death. What Harold didn't realize was that the entity wearing his wife's face was feeding on his grief, slowly manipulating him toward suicide. This is the true story of how a mysterious guardian saved Harold from both supernatural evil and his own darkest thoughts. But by the end of this tale, Harold would discover something that would shake him to his core, something that would make him question whether his savior was even human at all. You see, Harold had been collecting Margaret's leftover heart medications, hiding them in an old coffee tin in the basement. Each night, as the lonely hours stretched endlessly before him, he would hold that tin and wonder if joining Margaret might be easier than living without her. The entity masquerading as his wife knew this. It could taste his desperation, and it was hungry for more than just his grief. It wanted his soul. But on a rain-soaked October night, when Harold stood at the very edge of oblivion, a stranger would appear at his door, a man in a wide-brimmed hat and dark coat, whose face remained hidden in shadow, would speak words that would save Harold's life. The guardian had arrived just in time to reveal a horrifying truth. The woman Harold had been speaking to each night wasn't Margaret at all. This is Harold's story. A story of love, loss, deception, and ultimately salvation. A story that proves that sometimes, when we're at our lowest point, help arrives from the most unexpected of places. And sometimes that help comes from sources that defy all explanation. Harold Jennings had lived in the same modest two-story home for 47 years. At 72, the retired electrician found himself navigating a world that no longer made sense without Margaret by his side. She had been his anchor, his reason for waking up each morning, and 6 months after her sudden heart attack, Harold was drowning in an ocean of loneliness. The house felt impossibly large and eerily quiet. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table where she'd left them. Her coffee mug remained in its usual spot in the cabinet. Harold couldn't bring himself to wash it, let alone use it. Her side of the bed stayed perfectly made, pillow fluffed exactly as she liked it. Harold's daily routine had become mechanical. Wake up around noon, stare at Margaret's photograph on the nightstand, shuffle to the kitchen for instant coffee and stale crackers. The television provided background noise, but he wasn't really watching. His children called weekly from their distant cities, Chicago and Denver, but Harold barely engaged in conversation. What was there to say? That he spent most days talking to Margaret's picture? That he'd stopped showering regularly? That he'd been saving her heart medication in a coffee tin downstairs? The loneliness was suffocating. Harold had worked for 35 years at Henderson Electric, where he'd been known for his steady hands and quiet competence. He'd fixed wiring in half the homes in their small Indiana town. But retirement had isolated him, and Margaret's death had severed his last real connection to the world. Their friends had tried to help initially. Casseroles appeared on his doorstep, neighbors invited him to church socials, and his bowling league buddies called regularly. But grief has a way of repelling well-meaning gestures. Harold politely declined invitations, claiming he wasn't ready. The truth was darker. He wasn't sure he wanted to be ready. Financial stress wasn't an issue. Harold's pension and Margaret's life insurance provided comfort, and the house was paid off. But money couldn't fill the Margaret-shaped hole in his existence. She had been the social one, the planner, the dreamer. Without her, Harold felt like half a person stumbling through an incomplete life. Sleep had become elusive. Harold would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering conversations with Margaret about growing old together. They'd planned to travel, maybe get a small RV and see the national parks. Those dreams now felt like cruel jokes. The bedroom felt too big, too quiet, too empty. It was during these sleepless nights that Harold first began to sense something changing in the house. Small things at first. Creaking floorboards that had never creaked before, subtle temperature shifts that made him pull blankets tighter around his shoulders. The house seemed to be breathing differently, as if something new had moved in to fill the emptiness Margaret had left behind. But Harold welcomed any change. Anything was better than the crushing silence that had become his constant companion. He had no idea that something ancient and malevolent had already begun circling his wounded spirit, drawn by the sweet scent of his despair. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening in early October. Harold was heating a can of soup when he heard it, Margaret's voice calling his name from upstairs. Not her sick voice from those final weeks, but her healthy, vibrant voice from their younger days. "Harold? Honey? Are you down there?" Harold's hand froze on the stove dial. His heart hammered against his ribs as he looked toward the ceiling. The voice had come from their bedroom, clear as day. For a moment, rational thought prevailed. Grief could cause auditory hallucinations. He'd read about this. But the voice came again, warmer this time, filled with the love he remembered. "I'm waiting for you, sweetheart." Harold abandoned his soup and climbed the stairs with more energy than he'd felt in months. The bedroom was empty, of course, but something had changed. Margaret's perfume, white shoulders, the scent she'd worn for 30 years, lingered in the air. Harold breathed deeply, feeling a spark of joy he'd thought was extinguished forever. "Margaret?" he whispered to the empty room. "Baby, is that really you?" Silence answered. But Harold felt watched, loved, less alone than he had in months. That night, he slept better than he had since the funeral. The encounters intensified over the following weeks. Margaret's voice became a regular presence, always gentle, always loving. She would call to him when he was eating dinner alone, her voice floating down from upstairs. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, a familiar silhouette in the hallway, the suggestion of someone sitting in Margaret's favorite chair. Harold began responding to the voice, having conversations with empty rooms. He told Margaret about his days, shared memories, even laughed occasionally when he remembered her terrible jokes. The house felt alive again, filled with purpose and love. Harold started showering regularly, shaving, even bought fresh groceries instead of living on canned soup. But as October deepened into November, the encounters took on a different quality. Margaret's voice, while still loving, carried an undertone of sadness that Harold hadn't noticed initially. "I miss you so much, Harold," the voice would say. "I'm so lonely without you." "I miss you too, baby," Harold would respond, tears streaming down his weathered face. "God, how I miss you." "Then why don't you come to me?" The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once now, surrounding Harold like an embrace. "I'm waiting for you, my love. I'll always be waiting." Harold began to understand. Margaret wasn't just visiting, she was calling to him, inviting him to join her wherever she was. The realization filled him with a mixture of joy and confusion. How could he reach her? What was she asking of him? The answer came to him gradually, whispered in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking. Margaret was trying to tell him something important, something about their future together. And slowly, Harold began to understand what she needed from him. It was during these revelations that Margaret began appearing more clearly. No longer just a voice or a shadow, she manifested in their bedroom after midnight, translucent but recognizable. She looked exactly as Harold remembered. Brown hair styled in the neat bob she'd worn for decades, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the blue nightgown she'd loved. "My darling Harold," she said during one particularly vivid visitation, "I've been trying to reach you for so long." Harold sat on the edge of their bed, tears of joy streaming down his face. "Margaret, my love, I knew you'd come back to me. I never left," she whispered, moving closer. "But I can't stay here, Harold. This place, this world, it's not where I belong anymore. And you don't belong here either, not without me." Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through old windows. "What do you mean?" Margaret's expression grew sad, desperate. "Look at yourself, my love. Look how you're suffering. Look how empty your life has become. Is this living? Is this what either of us would want?" Harold looked around their bedroom, unmade bed, dirty clothes piled in corners, empty bottles of Margaret's heart medication scattered on her nightstand. She was right. This wasn't living. It was merely existing in a state of prolonged dying. "But what can I do?" Harold asked. "How can I reach you?" Margaret smiled then, but it wasn't the warm smile Harold remembered. There was something hungry about it, something that made his skin crawl even as his heart leaped with hope. "You still have my medication, don't you, Harold? All those pills you've been saving?" Harold nodded, feeling a strange mix of shame and excitement. He had been collecting Margaret's leftover heart medication, telling himself he didn't know why, but deep down, he'd always known. "Then you know what you need to do," Margaret continued, her voice taking on an urgent quality. "Come to me, Harold. Take those pills and come to me. We can be together again forever. No more loneliness, no more pain. Just us, like it always should have been." The suggestion should have horrified Harold, but instead, it filled him with a sense of relief he hadn't felt since Margaret's diagnosis. Of course. Why hadn't he thought of it sooner? Margaret was showing him the way to end his suffering, to reunite with the only person who had ever truly mattered. But as Harold rose to retrieve the coffee tin from the basement, something nagged at him. Margaret's eyes, usually so kind and familiar, seemed different tonight, hungrier. And when she smiled, encouraging him toward the basement door, Harold caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze. Her teeth seemed sharper than he remembered, and her eyes reflected light like an animal's in the darkness. Harold stood in his basement, holding the coffee tin containing Margaret's medication. 37 pills, more than enough to join his beloved wife permanently. Margaret's voice drifted down from upstairs, encouraging, loving, urgent. "Hurry, my darling, I can't wait much longer. They're trying to take me away from you." "Who's trying to take you?" Harold called up, his hand trembling on the tin's lid. "The others," Margaret's voice replied, and for just a moment it sounded different, raspier, hungrier. "They don't understand our love. They want to keep us apart forever." Harold was about to open the tin when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. The basement fell silent. Even Margaret's voice stopped. Harold looked up at the ceiling, confused. Who would visit at nearly midnight on a stormy November night? The knocking came again, more insistent. Harold set down the tin and climbed the basement stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he reached the main floor, he realized the house felt different, colder, and strangely empty in a way it hadn't moments before. Harold opened the front door to find a tall figure standing in the rain. The man wore a dark overcoat and a wide-brimmed fedora that cast deep shadows over his face. Only his chin was visible in the dim porch light, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "Harold Jennings," the stranger said. It wasn't a question. "May I come in? We need to talk Something about the man's presence made Harold step aside without question. The stranger entered, removing his hat, but somehow keeping his face in shadow despite the indoor lighting. Harold caught impressions of age and kindness, but couldn't make out specific features. "I'm sorry," Harold said, suddenly aware he was in his pajamas and probably looked terrible. "Do we know each other? It's awfully late for—" "That woman upstairs," the stranger interrupted gently. "The one you've been talking to? That's not your wife, Harold." Harold's blood went cold. I don't know what you mean." The stranger moved to Harold's living room, studying the family photographs on the mantel. He picked up Harold and Margaret's wedding picture, holding it with careful reverence. 45 years of marriage, the stranger observed. A beautiful love story. Margaret was a remarkable woman, kind, patient, wise. She made you a better man, didn't she, Harold? How do you know about Margaret? Harold's voice was barely a whisper. The stranger set down the photograph and turned toward Harold. Even in the lamplight, his face remained mysteriously obscured, as if shadows clung to him naturally. The question isn't how I know about Margaret, Harold. The question is, do you really believe Margaret would want you to end your life? Do you think the woman who spent 45 years loving you, supporting you, encouraging you to be your best self, would ask you to commit suicide? Harold felt tears streaming down his face. But she's been so lonely, so sad. She needs me. Margaret is at peace, Harold. She's exactly where she needs to be. What's been visiting you, what's been manipulating your grief and loneliness, that's something else entirely. Something that feeds on despair and grows stronger with each life it claims. As if summoned by their conversation, Margaret's voice drifted down from upstairs, but now it sounded different, urgent, angry. "Harold, who is that man? Don't listen to him. Come upstairs right now." The stranger's expression hardened. "Do you hear it, Harold? The demand in her voice? Does that sound like the woman you married?" Harold listened with new ears. The voice upstairs was commanding, manipulative in a way Margaret never had been. His real wife had been gentle, patient, never demanding. What is it?" Harold asked. "An entity that feeds on human suffering," the stranger explained. "It saw your grief, your isolation, and decided you'd make an easy target. It's been slowly convincing you that death is the answer to your pain, growing stronger with each day you've moved closer to the basement." Harold sank into his recliner, overwhelmed. How do I make it stop?" The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew something. Harold couldn't quite see what, but it seemed to catch and hold light in impossible ways. "First, you need to understand something crucial, Harold. Your life has value beyond your relationship with Margaret. She loved you not just as her husband, but as a man with purpose, compassion, and wisdom to share with the world. Ending your life dishonors everything she believed about you." From upstairs came a sound that was definitely not Margaret, a low, growling noise filled with rage and hunger. "Harold!" the not Margaret shrieked. "Kill that man! Kill him now and come to me!" The stranger smiled grimly. "There's the truth. Harold, I need you to go to that basement and destroy those pills. Flush them down the toilet, scatter them in the yard, I don't care how, but remove that temptation from your life permanently." "What about it? Will it come after me?" "When you make the choice to live, to truly live and not just exist, you take away its power. These entities are scavengers, Harold. They can't create despair. They can only feed on what already exists and amplify it. Choose hope instead of despair, purpose instead of emptiness. and it will lose its hold on you. The creature upstairs let out a howl that shook the windows. The lights flickered, and Harold felt a pressure in his head like a migraine coming on. "Go now, Harold," the stranger urged. "Every moment you delay makes it stronger." Harold rushed to the basement, the stranger following close behind. As he reached for the coffee tin, the entity's true form materialized at the bottom of the stairs, no longer resembling Margaret at all, but a writhing mass of shadow and hunger with glowing red eyes and teeth like broken glass. "Mine!" it shrieked. "He's mine!" Harold grabbed the tin, his hands shaking violently. The entity lunged forward, but the stranger stepped between them, raising whatever he held in his hand. Light filled the basement, not harsh artificial light, but something warm and golden that pushed back the creature's darkness. "You have no power here," the stranger said calmly. "Harold has chosen life." With determination he didn't know he possessed, Harold twisted off the tin's lid and dumped the pills onto the basement floor. Using his heel, he crushed them one by one, each grinding motion seeming to diminish the entity's size and fury. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting wail before dissolving into nothing. The basement fell silent except for Harold's heavy breathing and the stranger's steady presence. "It's over," the stranger said gently. "You're free." Harold collapsed into an old chair, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relief. I almost really did it. But you didn't. That's what matters. Harold, your story isn't over. Margaret's love didn't die with her. It lives in you, in the kindness you can show others, in the wisdom you've gained through decades of living. There are people in this world who need what you have to offer. Harold looked up at the stranger. "Like what?" "I'm just a broken-down old electrician. You're a man who knows what real love looks like, who understands loss and loneliness. Do you know how many people in your community are struggling with exactly what you've been through? Elderly people losing spouses, isolated and forgotten. You could be a light in their darkness, Harold." The stranger's words sparked something in Harold's chest. Not the desperate hope he'd felt when he thought Margaret was calling to him, but something steadier and more sustainable. "The community center downtown runs a grief support group," the stranger continued. "They need volunteers, people who understand, who can listen without judgment. And the soup kitchen on 5th Street serves meals to anyone who needs them. Lonely people, Harold. People who could use a kind word and a reminder that someone cares." Harold nodded slowly. "Margaret always said I was a good listener. She was right. You have gifts to share, Harold. A lifetime of love and experience shouldn't end because Margaret's physical presence has ended. She lives on through the love you show others." Harold stood up, feeling stronger than he had in months. "Thank you," he said, turning to face the stranger fully. "I don't even know your name, but you saved my life. How can I ever?" But the basement was empty. Harold spun around, calling out, but no one answered. The stranger had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared, leaving only the faint scent of rain and something Harold couldn't identify, something clean and protective and ancient. Harold climbed the basement stairs with a lightness he hadn't felt since Margaret's death. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful, clean. The oppressive atmosphere that had been building for weeks was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like Margaret's actual presence, warm, loving, and encouraging. That night, Harold slept better than he had in months, and when he woke up, instead of staring at Margaret's photograph with despair, he found himself smiling at the memory of her laugh and planning his first visit to the community center. 2 weeks later, Harold had become a regular volunteer at both the grief support group and the soup kitchen. He discovered that helping others process their own losses was healing his heart in ways he'd never expected. The community center had become his second home, and the people there had welcomed him with the warmth Margaret always said he deserved. But Harold couldn't stop thinking about the stranger who had saved his life. He wanted to thank the man properly, maybe invite him for coffee and conversation. Someone with that kind of wisdom and compassion deserved recognition. Harold decided to check his home security system, a simple camera doorbell he'd installed the previous year after a series of package thefts in the neighborhood. If the stranger had visited that night, the camera would have recorded him approaching the door. Harold pulled up the footage on his tablet, scrolling to the timestamp from that rainy November night. He watched himself move through the house, saw himself standing in the living room talking to no one. Harold rewound the footage and watched again, more carefully this time. The recording clearly showed Harold opening the front door to empty space, stepping aside as if allowing someone to enter, then closing the door behind nothing but air. The entire conversation Harold remembered having in his living room appeared to be him talking to himself. But that was impossible. Harold remembered every detail: the man's voice, his presence, the way he'd stood between Harold and the entity in the basement. Harold scrolled through the basement camera footage, watching himself crush the pills while appearing to be completely alone. Harold's hands trembled as he set down the tablet. The stranger had been real, hadn't he? The conversation, the intervention, the mysterious light that had banished the entity, all of it had felt absolutely genuine. But the cameras showed no evidence of any visitor that night. Harold walked to his front door and stepped outside, looking up and down the quiet street. The rational part of his mind insisted the stranger had been a hallucination, a manifestation of his own subconscious desire to live. But deep in his heart, Harold knew better. The stranger had been real, just not in any way that cameras could capture. Harold smiled, looking up at the gray November sky. "Thank you," he whispered to whoever might be listening. "Whatever you are, wherever you came from, thank you." A gentle breeze stirred the bare tree branches, and for just a moment, Harold could swear he smelled that same clean, protective scent that had lingered in his basement after the stranger disappeared. Guardian angels, Margaret had always insisted, were real. She'd believed they watched over good people during their darkest moments, intervening when needed most. Harold had always been skeptical of such things. Not anymore. As Harold returned to his house, his home, he felt Margaret's presence one final time. Not the hungry, desperate entity that had tried to manipulate him, but something warm and loving and proud. His real wife, somehow, was smiling at the choice he'd made and the life he was choosing to rebuild. Harold Jennings had been saved by a guardian, and now, by helping others navigate their own darkness, Harold was becoming a guardian himself. The camera might not have captured his visitor that night, but Harold's transformed life was proof enough that sometimes, when we need them most, angels walk among us wearing wide-brimmed hats and speaking with voices full of ancient wisdom. And sometimes they arrive just in time to remind us that our stories aren't over. They're just beginning a new chapter.